Welcome all to the APUSH Dig. This time we will turn our analytical eyes to a development in U.S. history we call the market revolution. In the first half of the 19th century, there emerged massive transformations in labor and manufacturing, in transportation and communication, and in almost all societal relationships. It feels sort of impossible to me to express the changes the market revolution brought to the U.S., but let's try anyway. When we examine the historical phenomenon we call the market revolution, what we're talking about is the importance of how new transportation systems and new industrial technologies dramatically expanded manufacturing and agricultural production, as well as dramatically altered society, workers' lives, and gender and family norms. The market revolution can be seen as the coming together of the early industrial revolution and the transportation revolution. All of this crashed together to create a true national economy for the first time. The national economy we can refer to as the market. No longer were people producing all of their household products at home themselves or purchasing them locally. Because of the rapid increase in the volume of manufactured goods produced in factories, and the transportation systems that they traveled along, people in one state can now be buying from and producing for people in an entirely different state. This economic explosion had many consequences. Here are just a few key ones. The growth of cities, industrialization, and the development of modern capitalism, where the capitalists who possess the wealth to invest in new businesses own the means of production and employ wage laborers who sell their labor power to the capitalists for an hourly rate. But the laborers do not own what they produce. That belongs to the capitalist, who then sells it on the free market, thus keeping all of the profits, or the surplus value taken from his workers. Also, think about the relationship between the rural areas and the urban areas. Farmers fed workers in the city, who in turn provided mass-produced goods to the farmers. Women enter the industrial workforce. Wages increase for many workers, but the gap between rich and poor in the United States increases exponentially. Thanks to the market revolution, a new middle class emerges, which shows more social mobility in the United States than in Europe. And northern textile industry facilitates rapid growth of the cotton industry and the expansion of slavery into new western areas like Alabama and Mississippi. It's important to also not forget that the U.S. government played a key role in aiding the development of the industrial capitalist system born alongside the market revolution. Though the Federalist Party may have decomposed, its Hamiltonian developmental economic vision lived on with the group called the National Republicans and its leader, Henry Clay. Clay's American system called for heavy government investing in building up the infrastructure needed to grow American industrial market capitalism. His plan for economic growth consisted of 4 parts. Protective tariffs. That way, Americans would much more likely buy from American factories rather than European factories. The National Bank. The National Bank would be the source of loans and funding for infrastructure projects. These projects include internal improvements, such as roads and canals. These could be built by private companies, but with public funding. So we see the beginnings of a private-public partnership in the economy. Later, when the National Republicans officially break with the Democratic Republicans, this will become the platform of the new Whig political party. As cities in the North were rapidly urbanizing and industrializing, we see the southern cities not developing in the same way. The West, however, will see a population boom as well as an economic boom. America's population almost doubles in the early 19th century, and people move west, and immigrants move west. And railroads helped link Western settlements to the eastern cities. Important Western industrial centers will develop in the next generation, places like Cleveland, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, Chicago, Illinois. The market revolution changed everything. The immense changes to society caused by the market revolution contributed to a second Great Awakening that influenced moral and social reforms. As life in the United States became more business-oriented, more economically driven, and much more devoted to the desires of capital, many people felt that old social issues were becoming worse and new issues were arising. A second Great Awakening inspired many Americans to use their religious zeal to address social issues. Here are some examples of reform movements in the 1830s through the 1850s. Temperance. The American Temperance Society formed to persuade drinkers to take a pledge of total abstinence from alcohol. Asylums. Dorothea Dix and mental hospitals, schools for the deaf and blind, prison reform. Public education. Horace Mann and the idea of common schools, or the nation's first public education system. Women's rights. There began a national movement for women's rights at Seneca Falls, New York, in the year 1848. And the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionist movement, intensifies in this period, though this movement was very diverse. For example, one wing of this movement was called the American Colonization Society. They wanted to see slavery end, but then they thought that the newly freed black people would not live in the United States. Instead, they would be sent to Africa. The American Anti-Slavery Society disagreed with this point of view. There were white abolitionists, there were black abolitionists, there were peaceful abolitionists and political abolitionists, and abolitionists who used writing to persuade others. And there was also violent abolitionists who sought to use violence to end the slave system. In 1848, a massive convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And this was the first ever convention dedicated to women's rights and women's issues. It was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, two women who were active in the anti-slavery movement, but felt that they were excluded from the movement because they were women. At this convention, these women and male allies wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, and listed a bunch of resolutions and grievances of women against men and against the patriarchy that dominated society. We need to understand that one of the most important consequences of the market revolution affected gender in the United States. In the market revolution, this was the first time that women could work for wages outside of the home. And therefore, women start to become more active in the public sphere. They're out from their father's home, they're out from their husband's home, they're in the workplace, they're talking to each other, they're getting involved in movements like the reform movements I showed you on an earlier slide. Therefore, they are challenging the cult of domesticity, the idea that a woman's realm was only in the home. And therefore, women played a key role in integrating their family into the new cash economy. So finally, let's reflect on some change due to the market revolution. Economically, the market revolution facilitated the transition to industrial capitalism and was the beginning of the end of subsistence farming, as the majority of Americans' lives were now to be dominated by the forces of the market. Industrial production will transform the North and West, creating urban centers linked by railroads. Socially, families were integrated into the market economy. The capitalists who control production started paying laborers an hourly wage for their labor power, but keeping all of the profits from the workers' labor for themselves. As society was propelled through myriad changes through the market revolution, Many in society felt that the burning issues were being ignored for the sake of economic growth. These reformers, inspired by the Second Great Awakening, began movements to address many of society's ills. And that's all for this time.